Picture this. Mist coils like a serpent through the jagged peaks of Appalachia, where the mountains stand as silent sentinels over secrets too heavy for the light. In a hollow carved by time, a cabin squats, its wood blackened by decades of rain and shame. Inside, a girl, barely 16, sits by a flickering hearth, her eyes hollow as the wind howling through the pines. She didn't know it yet, but her body was already a cage, her blood a chain. And what happened in that cabin would stain the mountains for generations, a wound that never healed. Subscribe to join us inside history's darkest rooms, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let us begin. In the late 19th century, the Appalachian Mountains were a world apart, a labyrinth of valleys where families lived in isolation, their lives governed by the rhythms of survival and the weight of tradition. Among them was the Hargrove clan, a family whispered about even among the tight-lipped mountain folk. Their cabin, perched on a ridge too steep for casual visitors, was a fortress of solitude and sin. The father, Elias Hargrove, was a man of iron will and darker appetites, his face carved with lines that spoke of hunger beyond the stomach. His daughter Mary was his shadow, raised not as a child but as a possession, her existence tethered to his every command. The major historical beat of this era was the isolation of Appalachian communities, where poverty and geography bred customs that defied the outside world's morality. Families like the Hargroves were not just poor, they were forgotten, left to fester in their own rules. Elias, a widower since Mary's mother died in childbirth, saw his daughter not as kin, but as a continuation of his own flesh, a vessel for his legacy. By 16, Mary was pregnant, not by a suitor, but by Elias himself. The shock moment came one winter night when the village midwife, summoned under moonlight, saw the truth in Mary's swollen belly and fled, her screams swallowed by the frost. She bore his seed in silence, but the mountains heard her pain. Mary's psychological state was a descent into dissociation, her mind fracturing under the weight of her father's touch. She learned to live in fragments, part daughter, part mother, part prisoner. Her days were spent tending the fire, her nights enduring Elias's weight, her body a battlefield where love and violation bled into one. The sensory detail of her existence was the creak of the cabin floorboards, each groan a reminder of her captivity, as if the house itself mourned her fate. The irony was suffocating. Elias called her his legacy, yet every child she bore tightened the noose around their family's future, their deformities a mirror of his twisted desires. This isolation mirrors today's hidden abuses. Think of cults cloaked in normalcy, where control masquerades as love. The Hargroves' story, though extreme, echoes in modern tales of coercion and secrecy, where victims are trapped not by mountains, but by manipulation. The first child, a boy named Amos, was born with eyes too wide and limbs too frail, his cries more animal than human. The village, already wary, began to whisper of curses, of a family damned by their own blood. Elias, undeterred, saw Amos as proof of his dominion, a living testament to his will. But Mary, holding her son, her brother, felt only a hollow dread. Her womb was a grave, and she was forced to dig it. The villagers' whispers grew louder, but none dared approach the cabin. The Hargroves were a wound in the mountains, festering in plain sight. But the cruelty had only just begun. Pause here. Would you confront Elias or flee like the midwife? Comment below and hit like if you're hooked. Poll. Was Mary a victim or complicit in silence? Vote now. Chapter marker. The blood-bound birth. The mist never lifted from the Hargrove Hollow, as if the mountains themselves exhaled shame. By Mary's 18th year, the cabin had become a prison of flesh and bone, its walls stained with the smoke of secrets. Elias's grip tightened, his obsession with his legacy growing as feral as the wolves that prowled the ridges. The major historical beat was the birth of a second child, a girl named Ruth, whose twisted spine and clouded eyes marked her as another casualty of Elias's madness. The shock moment came when Elias, in a fit of drunken rage, branded Mary's wrist with a heated iron, a circle of seared flesh to mark her as his forever. Her scream was a hymn to despair, and the mountains sang it back. Mary's psychological insight was her growing paranoia, a gnawing fear that the mountains themselves were watching, judging, waiting to swallow her whole. She began to see faces in the shadows, her mother's perhaps, or her own, warped by time and torment. The sensory detail was the iron's hiss, its acrid smoke curling like a ghost around her wrist, a permanent chain no rust could break. The irony was brutal. Elias branded her to claim her, yet the mark only deepened her resolve to survive. A silent rebellion kindled in her bones. This paranoia finds echoes in today's world, where surveillance, whether by cameras or social scrutiny, binds us to unseen masters, a digital brand we cannot escape. Ruth's birth drew more whispers from the village below. The preacher, a gaunt man named Caleb, spoke of divine retribution, warning that the Hargroves' sins would curse the land itself. Yet Elias, emboldened, began to preach his own gospel, claiming his bloodline was sacred, chosen by some primal god of the mountains. He forced Mary to parade Amos and Ruth before the cabin's single window, their deformities a grotesque banner of his pride. The villagers, too fearful to act, turned their backs, leaving Mary to her fate. She was a queen of ashes, crowned by her own father's hand. Mary's nights were a descent into madness, her dreams filled with visions of escape, running through forests that bled red, only to find Elias waiting at every turn. She began to hide small things, a sharpened stone, a scrap of cloth, as if these could one day free her. But Elias's eyes were everywhere, his hands a constant threat. The second child's birth had sealed her role not just as daughter, but as mother to her siblings, a role that twisted her identity into knots. The cabin's walls seemed to close in, each creak a reminder that her body was not her own. What they did next defies imagination. Pause here. Would you hide Mary's secret or expose Elias to the village? Comment below and hit like if you're hooked. Poll. Did Elias believe his own lies, or was he pure evil? Vote now. Chapter marker. The branded wrist. The Hargrove cabin stood like a wound in the mountains, its timbers groaning under the weight of unspoken sins. By Mary's 20th year, the hollow had become a crucible, forging despair into something sharper, more dangerous. The major historical beat was the birth of a third child, a boy named Jonah, whose malformed limbs and ceaseless wails seemed to mock Elias's dreams of a divine bloodline. The shock moment came when Elias, in a fevered ritual, held Jonah aloft before a crude altar of bones and candles, proclaiming him a prophet of their cursed dynasty, only for the child to choke on his own malformed throat, dying in Mary's arms as Elias raged at the heavens. His cries were a blade, and her heart was the wound. Mary's psychological state was now a storm of suppressed rage, a fire banked beneath her silence. She no longer saw herself as human, but as a vessel of suffering, her body a map of her father's cruelty. The sensory detail was the altar's candles, their wax dripping like blood onto the floor, pooling around Mary's bare feet as she cradled Jonah's lifeless form. The irony was merciless. Elias's altar, meant to sanctify his lineage, became a graveyard for his ambitions, each dead child a stone in his crumbling empire. This rage mirrors today's silent rebellions. Think of whistleblowers who risk everything to expose hidden abuses, their voices breaking through systems built to silence them. The village below had grown restless. Preacher Caleb's sermons now named the Hargroves explicitly, calling their cabin a den of devils. Yet fear still held the villagers back, their whispers of curses and divine wrath chaining them as surely as Mary was bound. Elias, sensing their judgment, grew more erratic, his nights spent muttering to the shadows, convinced the mountains themselves conspired against him. He began to carve symbols into the cabin's walls, spirals and crosses, etched with a knife that glistened with his own blood. He built a throne of madness, but its only crown was ruin. Mary, meanwhile, clung to her secret hoard, the sharpened stone, now joined by a rusted nail and a stolen knife. Her paranoia had hardened into purpose, each stolen moment a step toward an impossible freedom. She whispered to Amos and Ruth, promising them a world beyond the cabin, though their vacant eyes offered no hope. The death of Jonah shattered something in her, not just grief, but a spark of defiance. She began to hum a lullaby her mother once sang, a fragile thread to a life before Elias's chains. But every note was a risk, every glance at the door a gamble. And in that blood-drenched moment, everything shifted. Pause here. Would you help Mary plan her escape, or warn the village of Elias's madness? Comment below and hit like if you're hooked. Poll, was Mary's rage a path to freedom or destruction? Vote now. Chapter. Marker, the candlelit corpse. The mountains seemed to lean closer, their shadows swallowing the Hargrove cabin as winter tightened its grip. By 1883, Mary was 22, her body scarred by births and brands, her soul a battlefield of hope and despair. The major historical beat was her first act of open rebellion. She poisoned Elias's stew with crushed foxglove, a plant she'd gathered in secret from the ridge. The shock moment came when Elias, writhing on the cabin floor, his lips foaming red, realized his daughter had betrayed him, his own blood turning against him as he clawed at her branded wrist. Her poison was slow, but her hatred was swift. Mary's psychological insight was a collision of guilt and liberation. She had killed the man who made her, yet his shadow still clung to her, a specter of fear that whispered she could never be free. The sensory detail was the stew's bitter steam, curling upward as Elias's eyes bulged, his hands grasping at a life slipping away. The irony was poetic. Elias, who saw Mary as his possession, was undone by her hand, his legacy poisoned by the very womb he claimed. This act of defiance echoes modern stories of victims reclaiming power. Think of survivors exposing their abusers, breaking cycles of silence with a single courageous act. The village, unaware of Elias's death, continued their wary distance, though Preacher Caleb's sermons grew bolder, hinting at a reckoning. Mary, now alone with Amos and Ruth, faced a new terror, the world beyond the cabin. She buried Elias under the floorboards, his body wrapped in the same blanket that had swaddled Jonah. The act was both burial and baptism, a severing of chains she could not yet believe. She buried her father, but his blood still ran in her veins. Amos, now 6, and Ruth, 4, were silent witnesses, their frail bodies a constant reminder of their cursed birth. Mary tried to teach them words, songs, anything to make them more than Elias's legacy, but their eyes held only the cabin's shadows. She began to plan an escape, gathering scraps of food and a tattered map stolen from Elias's belongings. But the mountains were vast, and the village below was no sanctuary. Its people had abandoned her long ago. Each night, she stared at the branded scar on her wrist, a chain she could not cut away. Her fate was sealed, though she did not yet know it. Pause here. Would you flee with Mary or stay to face the village's judgment? Comment below and hit like if you're hooked. Poll. Did Mary's poison make her a hero or a monster? Vote now. Chapter marker. The poisoned stew. The cabin, now a tomb for Elias's rotting corpse beneath the floor, echoed with the frail breaths of Mary and her children. Spring of 1884 brought a thaw to the mountains, but no warmth to Mary's soul. At 23, she ventured down the ridge for the first time in years, Amos and Ruth trailing like ghosts behind her. The major historical beat was the village's confrontation. Preacher Caleb, rallied by tales of Elias's absence, led a mob to the Hargrove Hollow, discovering the poisoned patriarch's shallow grave and Mary's branded secrets. The shock moment came when Caleb, in righteous fury, seized Ruth and held her deformed face to the torchlight, declaring her a spawn of Satan, as the child wailed, her cries tearing through the night like flesh from bone. Her blood called out for judgment, and the mountains delivered it. Mary's psychological state was a vortex of delusion, convincing herself that freedom was within reach, even as the chains of her past dragged her down. She saw Elias in every shadow, his voice whispering that she was no better than him, her hands stained with the same crimson madness. The sensory detail was the mob's torches, their flames licking the air like hungry tongues, casting elongated shadows that bound Mary tighter than any iron. The irony was devastating. Mary had broken Elias's chains only to forge new ones from the villagers' fear, her act of liberation becoming her condemnation. This delusion reflects today's echo chambers, where misinformation breeds mobs. Think of online witch hunts that destroy lives under the guise of justice. The mob dragged Mary and her children to the village square, where whispers turned to shouts. Amos, frail and mute, cowered as stones pelted his skin, drawing blood that mingled with the dirt. Ruth's twisted form was paraded as evidence of divine wrath, her eyes mirrors of Elias's, pleading in silence. Mary fought back, her voice a ragged scream, recounting Elias's cruelties, but the villagers saw only a witch who had slain her father and birthed abominations. Preacher Caleb pronounced sentence, exile or death, but mercy stayed his hand for the children. She had birthed a dynasty of doom, and now it crumbled at her feet. Mary's mind fractured further in the chaos, visions of escape blurring with memories of the cabin's confines. She clutched her branded wrist, the scar a throbbing reminder that chains could be invisible, woven from blood and judgment. As the mob closed in, she whispered a final lullaby to Amos and Ruth, a fragile shield against the storm. The mountains watched impassively, their mists coiling like serpents ready to strike. But the cruelty had only just begun. Pause here. Would you spare Mary mercy or demand her exile? Comment below and hit like if you're hooked. Poll. Was the village's judgment fair or fueled by fear? Vote now. Chapter. Marker. The torchlit trial section. 6. The echo of chains. The mountains, eternal and unforgiving, swallowed the Hargrove legacy as the mist claimed the dawn. Mary, bound in ropes that bit like Elias's brand, was marched from the village, Amos and Ruth torn from her arms and given to childless families who saw them as penance rather than kin. The major historical beat was the dissolution of the inbred dynasty. Mary vanished into the wilderness, her body found months later, ravaged by wolves or madness, while her children faded into folklore, their deformities spawning tales of cursed bloodlines that haunted Appalachia for generations. The shock moment came in Mary's final delirium, where she clawed at her own womb, screaming visions of Elias rising from the grave, his chains wrapping around her throat in a crimson embrace. Her end was a whisper, but her suffering roared eternal. Mary's final psychological insight was a crushing betrayal of self, realizing her blood had chained not just her, but unborn generations to a cycle of madness and deformity. The sensory detail was the rustle of leaves under her stumbling feet, each step a rattle of invisible shackles, the wind carrying echoes of her children's cries. The irony was profound. She had sought to break the chains, yet they rusted into legend, binding the mountains in perpetual whisper. This betrayal lingers in modern genetics and family secrets. Think of inherited traumas that echo through DNA, unseen chains linking past to present. As Mary's bones bleached under the sun, the villagers wove her story into ballads and warnings, a cautionary opera of blood and folly. Amos and Ruth, renamed and hidden, carried the Hargrove curse in their veins, their offspring bearing subtle marks, twisted limbs, vacant stares that fueled midnight tales. The cabin crumbled, its timbers reclaimed by the earth, but the chains remained, symbolic motifs etched in folklore. Rusted shackles of incest and isolation, thumbnails for nightmares. What price do we pay for the chains we forge in silence? Power, cruelty, legacy. All rust in time, yet their echoes bind us still. In today's power struggles, think fractured families divided by secrets. What do you see? Comment below. And that was the price of being born in blood. Chapter marker. The rusted legacy.